Okay, again, good to see everyone tonight. So this is the first in a two-part series on memory in the 3 weeks and memory in Tisha B'Av. Tonight we'll be talking about the concept of Zekher Chorban, and in 2 weeks we'll be talking about Zekher Mikdash, as well, and then we'll also bring these two concepts together and talk about how they're related. Before we dive into the text that I wanted to look at with you tonight, I want to just say that this sheer series is being sponsored by Naomi Stein in loving memory of her uncle, Kenneth Goldfarb of blessed memory, who was killed in action. I believe he was a bomber pilot who was killed in action around his 20th birthday in World War II. So his neshama should have an aliyah in Gan Eden, and our learning should be to his merit.
Amen. Thank you.
So Zekher Chorban literally means to remember the destruction, and Zekher Mikdash means to remember the Mikdash, to remember the temple. And both these phrases appear in our tradition, and they both speak to remembering the Beit HaMikdash, remembering the temple that stood in Jerusalem. But they don't, and sometimes in the way they're used, we might think that they're the same thing or very similar. But in fact, they offer two different ideas about how we remember and really what our focus should be during this period of the 3 weeks leading into Tisha B'Av. So tonight, let's start by exploring the parameters of Zekher Chorban, remembering the temple's destruction, and then we'll see where that leads us. I'm going to share my screen so everyone can take a look at these sources with me. And if you have any questions or comments, please just feel free to jump in and interrupt and share your thoughts or your questions. Okay. And if people start to hear background noise and want me to mute people, just let me know and we can do that as well. But right now I feel like we're a small group, and at least it seems to be, I'm not hearing background noise. So if that's working for people, then we'll continue as is. If anyone has issues, just let me know. Okay, so the origin in many ways, at least let's say, of Zekher Chorban can be traced back to a Gemara that appears in Masechet Bava Batra. So the Gemara in Bava Batra says, Tana Rabbanan, the sages taught, that when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews, the number of people who separated themselves, and we'll see what they were separating themselves from in a second, whose practice was not to eat meat and not to drink wine. So this idea, a number of people, we don't know how many, but at least a number of people after the destruction of the Mikdash responded to it by saying they were no longer going to eat meat or drink wine, not just during the 9 days like we do, but ever. They were just going to cease from this altogether. And it's interesting to think about why this appears only after the destruction of the second Mikdash. The Gemara makes that point clear. Doesn't appear to have happened after the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. Some of the commentaries say that after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, there was a feeling that this was going to be a longer period of exile, or this practice sort of developed after it became clear to people that it was going to be a longer period of exile. And so it was sort of maybe it wasn't even an immediate response to the loss, but a sort of delayed response to the loss. Rebbe Yeshua joined these group of ascetics to discuss their practice. And he said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat and do not drink wine?" They said to him, "Shall we eat meat from which the offerings were sacrificed upon the altar? And now the altar has ceased to exist. Shall we drink wine, which is poured as a libation upon the altar? And now the altar has ceased to exist." So for this group of people, the way in which they responded to the loss of the Mikdash was by abstaining from something. And the things they abstained from weren't random. Instead, they were at the heart of the practices that occurred in the Beit HaMikdash. Bringing sacrifices, bringing offerings. Those were the things they felt like without a Mikdash, they could no longer practice, they could no longer touch even, because without the Mikdash, somehow the only response was to abstain from these things altogether. Rabbi Yeshua said to them, "If so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings that were offered upon the altar have ceased." And they replied, "You are correct. It's possible to subsist with just produce." And so Rabbi Yeshua says it wasn't just meat and wine that was offered, but also lechem. Bread was offered sometimes as an offer, brought as a sacrifice, as an offering sometimes. So you also shouldn't eat bread. And they said, "You're right. We'll just eat produce." And he said to them, "We will not eat produce either, because the Bikurim, the first fruits, also have ceased." And they replied, "You're correct. We will no longer eat the produce of the 7 species from which the first fruits were brought, as it's possible to subsist on other produce." And he said to them, "If so, we will not drink water, since the water libation has ceased." They were silent, as they realized they could not survive without water. So this group of people wanted to respond, or responded to their feeling of loss, demonstrated their feeling of loss by abstaining from things that reminded them of practices that had existed in the Mikdash. And they remind themselves of the temple's destruction by abstaining from these things. But their practice was so broad that Rabbi Yeshua pointed out to them that if they took their logic if they followed their logic to its endpoint, they basically wouldn't even be able to drink water. Rabbi Yeshua said to them, but Rabbi Yeshua wasn't telling them that their whole way of approaching this issue was wrong. Instead, he said to them, "My children, come and I will tell you how we should act. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued and the temple has been destroyed. But to mourn excessively as you're doing is also impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it. As it is written, you are cursed with a curse, yet you rob me, even this whole nation." Rabbi Yeshua continues, "Rather, this is what the sages said. A person may plaster his house with plaster, but he must leave over a small amount in it without plaster to remember the destruction of the temple, as a Zekher l'chorban." So what is Rabbi Yeshua's objection to this practice, to their practice? It's an interesting objection. What's the issue he has with it? So the issue he has with it seems to be not just you can't exist without drinking water, and this practice isn't sustainable for the people who want to observe it, but that the loss of the Mikdash, Zekher l'chorban, the feeling of the remembering of the temple's destruction, has to be a communal practice. It has to be a communal memory, and you can't remember the temple's destruction with a practice that the community won't be able to observe in its entirety. And maybe there are people who are unique and extreme in their practice who would be able to abstain from all these things, even water. They'd be able to hydrate themselves through produce or something like that. But Rabbi Yeshua is saying we can't make a decree that the community as a whole won't be able to abide by. So instead, he says these are the parameters of the practice of Zekher l'chorban, of remembering the temple's destruction. One is that when you plaster or you paint your house, you have to leave over a small amount in it without plaster to remember the destruction of the temple. And then the Gemara asks a very Gemara-esque question, and how small is a small amount? And Rabbi Yeshua said it's just a small amount. You paint your whole house, but one part you leave untouched. Rav Yosef said, 1 cubit by 1 cubit. Rav Hista said, This should be opposite the entrance so that it is visible to all. So it's a relatively small space on the wall, but Rav Hista said it should be in a location where people are going to be able to see it. And Rabbi Yeshua continued with another way in which we observe Zekher Chorban. He said the sages said that a person may prepare for all that he needs for a meal, but he must leave out a small item to remember as Zekher Chorban, to remember the temple's destruction. What is a small item? Rav Papa said something akin to small fried fish. So you can have your meat, you can have your wine. Maybe even you should have your meat and your wine. But a piece of the appetizer, a piece of the dessert, something small, you should leave out from a meal as a Zekher Chorban. Rabbi Yeshua continues, the sages said that a woman may engage in all of her, the translation here is cosmetic treatments, but I would have translated it more like bedecked. She can wear all of her jewelry. But she must leave out a small matter to remember as a Zekher Chorban, to remember the temple. What is a small matter? Rav said she does not remove hair from the place on the temple from which women would remove their hair. As it said, if I forget your shalayim, let my right hand forget its cunning, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I remember you not, if I set not your shalayim before my highest joy. And what is the meaning of my highest joy? Rav Yitzhak says this is referring to the burnt ashes that are customarily placed on the head of a groom at the time of their wedding, to remember as a Zekher Chorban. Rav Papa said to Abaye, where are they placed? And Abaye said, they're placed where the tefillin are placed. As it said, to appoint them that morn in Zion, to give them a garland in place of ashes. And anyone who mourns rather for the destruction of Yerushalayim will merit to see its joy, as it stated, rejoice with Yerushalayim. So the Gemara here gives us a number of practices that qualify as Zekher Chorban. And what type of practices are these? They largely seem to be practices of abstaining, not abstaining in the extreme way we saw initially, but in small ways, not completing a project, not completing a meal, not bedecking oneself as fully as one could, remaining sort of incomplete in a way, as a Zekher. That to be incomplete, to have a lack is how we observe Zekher Chorban. The only exception to this, that in terms of let's say the idea that Zekher Chorban comes from not doing something or abstaining, is this idea of the ashes, of placing the ashes on one's head, on the head of a groom right before their wedding, right where the tefillin go. And this custom, actually, just as an aside, is not widely observed today. It's something that I always find very meaningful. Whenever I officiate a wedding, I always do it with the groom beforehand. A very similar version of our Gemara, a very similar discussion to what
Rabbi, I'm just jumping in there, talking
Sure.
about the ashes on the head for a wedding. It's one of those little details that I realize many people always forget, and they look around who's got matches. I've heard that so many times at a wedding. I'm like, oh, it's the ashes time.
Yes. Right. So a very similar discussion to the Sugya in our Gemara also appears in Tosefta. The Tosefta is a collection of rabbinic teachings that are from the same time as the Mishnah, so roughly from the year 0 to the year 200. Rabbi Yishmael said, from the day that the Mikdash was destroyed, it would be appropriate that we not eat meat or drink wine, but a court does not place restrictions on the community which they can't uphold. He would say that since the Romans, decree upon us that we not learn Torah, we should decree upon the community that they not marry. Since people, without learning Torah, you're not going to know all the law, all the halachot that govern marriage and family purity, and not have children. But as a consequence of that, though, if we said that, the seed of Abraham will cease. Rather, the Tosefta says, leave Israel alone. It's better that if they transgress, they do so inadvertently and not intentionally. And this is the source of a sort of famous principle that it's better for someone to violate, to transgress b'shogeg accidentally or without knowing than b'mezid, intentionally. And the Tosefta concludes, all that mourn Yerushalayim in this world will rejoice with her in the world to come. That it says, rejoice with Yerushalayim and be glad for her. All you who love her, join her in jubilation. All you who mourn over her. So that our Tosefta here ends very similar to how the Sugya and the Gemara end. There's one key difference, which is the Tosefta seems to offer a little bit of a different theology about where mourning, how we will how those who mourn for Yerushalayim will then rejoice with Yerushalayim. The Gemara makes it sound like perhaps this will happen in this world. Obviously, there have been many people who mourn for Yerushalayim and didn't get to see its, haven't gotten to see its redemption. The Tosefta says that anyone who mourns in this world will see its redemption in the world to come. We probably could have a whole shiur just on this idea of what that might mean. We'll save that for another time. These ideas about what constitutes Zekher L'Chorban largely get codified in the Shulchan Aruch. So you look in the Code of Jewish Law, you'll see that there's a halacha that you should leave a part of your house unpainted or unplastered, incomplete, that one shouldn't wear all of their jewelry at once, then that one should leave something out of a meal when they're eating as well, and of course this practice of ashes. What's missing from this list that I think for many people is the sort of major custom that they associate with Zekher L'Chorban? It's also, the hint is that it's also a wedding custom.
The breaking of the glass, no?
Yes, the breaking of the glass, right? It's not here. Kind of oddly enough, it doesn't appear in this list at least. So let's see where that comes from. We'll take a look in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch says at the time the temple was destroyed, the sages of that generation decreed that one should not paint and mold one's house like the house of kings, but rather one should plaster one's house with mortar and whitewash it with lime. One should leave a place, a square cubit inside, opposite the entrance, without whitewash, without paint or plaster. But if one acquires a painted and molded courtyard that is permitted as already like that, and one's not obligated to peel away what is on the walls. So before we talk about the breaking of the glass at the wedding, here the Shulchan Aruch is codifying for us what we saw in the Gemara about leaving a portion of one's house unplastered or unpainted. But it's striking, I think it tells us a lot about how we're supposed to experience this mitzvah or this custom in the last phrase. Because fundamentally this custom is about leaving something unfinished and incomplete. If one buys a house that's already totally done and already completed, you don't have to strip away the paint or the plaster to observe this practice. We don't complete something as a Zekher L'Chorban, as a memory that the Mikdash is in ruins, that the world in some way is fundamentally incomplete. Our observance in this way of Zekher L'Chorban is through abstaining from completing a project. But we don't have to actively go and peel away the layers of paint or plaster on a house that we buy that already is finished. We don't have to we don't complete something as a sign of Zekher L'Chorban, but we don't have to undo it or damage it in some way. Zekher L'Chorban largely is about what we don't do, not what we do. An exception, though, to this we'll see might be this custom of breaking a glass. And similarly, they decree that one who lays a table for guests should leave something missing and leave a place without a bowl that would have been suitable to place there, So this is maybe it's at a meal, it's not just about the food that's put out, but also about how we arrange the table. And when someone puts ornaments or jewelry of silver or gold, they should leave one missing, which are customary. So the ornaments are so that one maybe won't be done up in a way that one could be, so that the ornament should not be complete. Again, this idea of incompletion. And when a groom marries a woman, take ashes from burnt food and place them on his head in the place where the tefillin rest. And it's ashes, of course, on the one hand, this is something active, but burnt food is something bad and something destroyed that didn't, no one intends really to burn food. And you place it on, as I mentioned, on the groom's head. And it's interesting here, the way that, at least the Shulchan Aruch makes it sound is like, is that there's going to be burnt food around. There's going to be ashes around. I also think in a day and age also when people smoked, right? There was oftentimes ash already around. You didn't have to create ash just for this purpose. But so you take ash that's already around and you place it on the groom's head. And then the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles adds, there are places where they're accustomed to break a cup during the wedding ceremony, or placing black cloth or other such item on the mourning on the head of the groom. And all these things are done in order to remember Yerushalayim. And it quotes, and the Ramah quotes the pasuk, the famous pasuk about not forgetting Yerushalayim. So where is this custom of breaking a glass at a wedding coming from, though? Because it's not in our Gemara. I'll just say, interestingly enough, the Ramah, when he talks about this practice, says there are 2 times in the wedding ceremony where one might break a glass, either where we do it at the very end or after the giving of the ring, really in the middle of the ceremony. So there's this idea also that you're connecting very closely the breaking with the moment, wherever that moment is, of greatest joy, as a way of ensuring that in one's joy you continue to observe a Zekher Chorban. You continue to remember the mikdash is in ruins and the incompleteness that exists. But let's see where this idea of breaking glass comes from. Oh, I'm sorry. One more halacha from the Shulchan Aruch that I wanted to share with you. And similarly, the sage is decreed on the crowns of grooms not to wear at all and not to dress the groom on his head with any wreath. As it says, remove the turban and lift off the crown. Similarly, it was decreed that on the crown of the bride, if it is silver, of thread is permissible, and specifically on a bride and groom, but other people, men and women, it was not decreed. So let's go look and see this, then we'll go back to that last Shulchan Aruch. Let's see though where this practice of breaking a glass comes from. So the Gemara in Brachot says that Abaye was sitting before his teacher Rabbah and saw that there was excessive joy. He said to Abaye, and Rabbah saw there was excessive joy, he said to Abaye, it's written, rejoice with trembling. One's joy should not be unrestrained. Mara said of Ravina, make a wedding feast for his son, and he saw the sages were excessively joyous. He brought a valuable cup with 400 sous and broke it before them, and they became sad. Rav Ashi made a wedding feast for his son. He saw the sages who were excessively joyous. He brought a cup of extremely valuable white glass and broke it before them, and they became sad. So what's the Gemara in Brachot describing? It seems to be describing a case where it seems to be talking about the importance of not becoming excessively joyful. And the Gemara here is not actually talking about Zekher Chorban or Zekher Mikdash or anything related to the Beit HaMikdash. It seems to be talking about a more general principle that excessive joy, maybe excessive lightheadedness, we might say, is something that people should avoid. and that breaking something valuable is a way of tamping down the room, tamping down the joy in the room. And the commentators debate whether or not this practice of breaking a glass at a wedding actually is connected to Zekher Chorban at all. So the Ramah clearly associates it with Zekher Chorban, and some of the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, do as well, but others don't. And others think that there is just at a wedding, as a general principle, people should rejoice, but that rejoicing should always take place within certain parameters. But it does seem like those who clearly those Rishonim who argue that this is connected to the idea of mourning the temple's destruction, and the Ramah, who also advanced that position, that becomes the one that sort of catches on in the way we conceive of this. We very much associate this breaking of the glass with Zekher Chorban, with remembering the Mikdash's destruction. One of the other sort of strange things about how this practice is, of course, observed today, is that we break the glass and then everyone shouts Mazel Tov. And that in some way, the breaking of the glass itself becomes a high point, a celebratory point of the wedding. So some poskim see this as problematic and think either the groom should recite the pasuk Imesh Kahech, if I forget you, Yerushalayim, or the rabbi should sort of remind people why we break the glass, but in a way, the glass is both very much in our mind associated with Zekher Chorban, but is also in some ways it's become seen as a joyful part of the ceremony. So it has this odd dual role to it today, or dual meaning that people associate with it today. I want to go back and look at one other halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch also says, one who sees Yerushalayim and her destruction, one who says Zion is a desert, a desolation, they quote a pasuk from Yeshayahu, and they tear one's garment, just like a mourner tears their garment. And when one sees the Beit HaMikdash, they say, our holy temple, our pride, where our fathers praise you, has been consumed by fire, and all that was dear to us is ruined. And from where is one obligated to rend? From Hatzofim. And afterwards, when he sees the Mikdash, he tears a second time. And all the tearings are a tefach. And if one comes from the way of the desert, then he sees the Mikdash first. He rends on the Mikdash a tefach. And afterwards, when he sees Yerushalayim, he adds the first rending a little bit. He adds the first tear a little bit. Depending on which direction you approach Yerushalayim from, if you approach from the east, you're going to see the Mikdash, or the place of the Mikdash, before you see the city. And if you approach from either the south or the west, you're going to see the city, and then you'll see the place of the Mikdash. But either way, here we have another, the other practices of Zekher Chorban. If they're not practices of abstaining from doing something, they're practices of destruction, breaking a glass, burning something to create ashes, tearing a garment. They're practices of destruction. I think this idea of practices of destruction is striking in a way, is the destruction and incompleteness. Is really there to remind us about absence, that we remember, that we accomplish this idea of Zekher Chorban, of reminding ourselves of the temple's destruction, of reminding ourselves of its absence, by either making something absent, by leaving something incomplete, or destroying something that's there, by reminding ourselves that what we think is there, or what we think should be there, is not there. A garment isn't supposed to be torn, it's supposed to be complete, but now there's a hole in it. A wall isn't supposed to have a spot on it that's bare of paint. You expect it to be complete, but it isn't. And the same thing with the idea of a meal or jewelry. Those practices are all about doing something to say 98% of the way and then stop it. To remind yourself right where you think something should be finished, it's not, because something is lacking. I want to quote a essay from Rav Soloveitchik, where he talks about mourning for or remembering something that happened after his wife passed away. And famously when Rav Soloveitchik's wife passed away, he had a very difficult time, and he very much mourned for her in ways that went above and beyond what's required. So Rav Schechter, in an article, mentioned that he writes that he would recite Kaddish for countless times, and it's known that the Rav recited Kaddish for his wife far longer than one is required to recite Kaddish for one's spouse. And he walked around the entire month wearing the jacket to which he had done Kriya in a lost and bewildered state. So normally one only wears the garment they tore after losing a loved one during Shiva, yet the Rav wore it the entire month. And he writes in this essay, on the 7th day of Pesach, 1967, I awoke from a fitful sleep. A thunderstorm was raging outside, and the wind and rain blew angrily through the window of my room. Half awake, I quickly jumped to my feet and closed the window. And I then thought to myself that my wife was sleeping downstairs in the sunroom next to the parlor. And I remembered that the window was left open there as well. She could catch pneumonia, which in her weakened physical condition would be devastating. The Rav's wife passed away of cancer. I ran downstairs, rushed into her room, and slammed the window shut. I then turned around to see whether she had awoken from the storm or if she was still sleeping. I found the room empty, the couch where she slept neatly covered. In reality, she had passed away the previous month. The most tragic and frightening experience was the shock that I encountered in that half second when I turned from the window to find the room empty. I was certain that a few hours earlier I had been speaking with her, and that about 10 o'clock she had said goodnight and retired to her room. I could not understand why the room was empty. I thought to myself, I just spoke with her. I just said goodnight to her. Where is she? And I think this idea of Zekher Chorban is about thinking everything is complete and then looking and realizing it's not. Thinking the house is fully built, and then as you scan the room, realizing that something is missing. Reaching for something at the table and thinking that it should be there, and then it's not. Something that we expect to be there, that we imagine is there, and then all of a sudden it's not. That absence, that confrontation with absence of missing something we expect to be there is supposed to remind us that the mikdash is lacking as well. That we can go through our daily life and imagine the world is complete. And then when we're confronted with absence, we're woken from that frame of thought. We're reminded that the world isn't complete. We're reminded that the mikdash is in ruins. And that the practices of Zekher Chorban are supposed to confront us with absence, with something that shouldn't be destroyed, something that should be perfect, a garment, and isn't. A room that should be complete and isn't. A meal that should be complete and isn't. The absence of something reminds us of the mikdash's absence. It reminds us of the temple's absence. And in that way, there's something both shocking and saddening about these practices. But perhaps there's also something else that can emerge from this confrontation with absence. I want to conclude with this source tonight. At the very end of the Gemara in Masechet Makot, there's a famous story about several of the rabbis who were traveling around Yerushalayim after the temple had been destroyed. And the Gemara says on another occasion, they were ascending to Yerushalayim after the destruction of the Mikdash when they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple. They tore their garments in mourning, just like we saw one is supposed to do. But when they arrived at Har Habayit, at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, of the Holy of Holies. They began to weep, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "This is the place concerning which it's written, and a non-priest, a non-Kohen who approaches it should die. And now foxes walk in it. Shouldn't we weep?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I am laughing. As it's written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Yeshayahu, Isaiah, he said, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Uriah. Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? He clarifies the difficulty. Uriah prophesies during Bayit Rishon, the first temple, and Zechariah prophesies during Bayit Sheni, at the very beginning of the second temple period. He was among those who returned from Babel to Eretz Israel. The verse established that the fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah is dependent on the fulfillment of the prophecy of Uriah. In the prophecy of Uriah, it's written, "Therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Yerushalayim shall become rubble, and the Mikdash as a place of a forest where foxes are found." And there is a rabbinic tradition that this was prophesied by Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it's written, "There shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Yerushalayim." Until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah should not be fulfilled, because the two prophecies are linked. Rabbi Akiva is saying one prophecy can't be fulfilled until the first one is. But now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, now that the prophecy regarding the Mikdash's destruction was fulfilled, down to the foxes, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah also will be fulfilled. The sages said to him, "Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us." So for Rabbi Akiva, he reframes this encounter with absence. Absence isn't just something to be mourned, but absence can also be a sign of what will come and fill that void. So that for Rabbi Akiva, he didn't just see the void. He didn't just see the absence. He was able to imagine what would one day fill that void. And that is the other aspect, I think, of Zekher L'Chorban. So that ultimately, it's supposed to shock us. It reminds us that about what's incomplete, reminds us about the Mikdash's destruction. It reminds us the world is incomplete, where we're confronted by absence. And it's about finding ways to incorporate that absence into our daily lives, so we don't forget what's lacking, so we don't forget the fundamental incompleteness that exists. But also, when we confront that absence, when we see that something is missing, it's not just about mourning the fact that there's this incompleteness. It's also about giving us an opportunity to imagine what will come, what can come, and what will come to fill that void. And that's the essence of the concept of Zekher L'Chorban.